Hello, everybody. Thank you again so much for joining us. I would like to welcome you all to the Using Imagination to Ignite and Excite Your Dream session. This session will be led by Erin McClartley, I'd like to introduce to you all. So, Erin is a writer, business owner, creative, and attorney by trade who helps clients all over the world create the worlds they want to live in by working with businesses, charities, institutions, and movement leaders to form structures, documents, and business models that reflect their values, dreams, purpose, and mission. This is all done through focus, healing, tools, community, and education. We are so delighted to have Erin speaking with us today, so join me in welcoming her to the virtual stage.
Thank you so much. I have been looking forward to this all week, and I am incredibly excited, and I appreciate the wonderful intro, Bernice. If we could click to the next slide, I'll go ahead and get us started. So as mentioned, my name is Erin. I am hailing from Houston, Texas, Karankawa land, if I'm being approximate. And really, I call myself a social impact architect. So what that means is I help people come up with visions of the world that they want to see, how they want that world to operate, how they want to feel in that world. And then I connect the dots to creating that world or that transformation or whatever it is that they want to work on. And I try to do it in a very holistic way, thinking about the whole person. So their history and their culture and their trials and triumphs and experiences and all the different things to really root them ultimately in their purpose. Because I think it's not only purpose that gives us momentum, but it's purpose that helps us create change. So I'm super excited to talk about imagination with you all because that is really fundamentally key to the way that I do my work and the work that I end up doing. Next slide. So in terms of setting our time up today, really I'll start with talking about language, because I think it's incredibly helpful when we have a sense of what do I mean when I say this? What do I mean when I say imagination? What do I mean when I say North Star? So I'll talk a little bit about that. Then we'll move into talking a little bit about setting up for imagination. What does it look like? The importance of this work. And then we'll actually dive into how I do the imagination work and have you do a couple exercises yourself. The hope is, as you're talking about bridging up the divide and why imagination is going to be so integral, and I might repeat myself here, is we will probably disagree on the what. So what you end up doing to get to the world that people want to get to, there's probably going to be some differences there, and probably even on the how, the values and things like that. But if we can gain trust in that I want to get to the same world that you want to get to, you can get past those divisions, right? You can start to really come up with some creative, dare I say innovative, but inclusive and equitable solutions. So excited to talk about that. Next slide. Asks. In terms of my asks of you today, I want this to be a value add. I want it to be I want it to be something that you walk away from saying, you know what, that was a good use of time. And so I'm going to ask that you have some autonomy in this and be thinking about what is one thing that I want to make absolutely certain I walk away with today? What is one thing I want to make sure that I learn? What is one question I want to ask? What is one tool that I want to make sure I have, or one situation I want to make sure to address? Just take a couple of seconds and think about what that might end up being, and then just make sure to ask. I do my best to be as broad in this as I can, but I won't necessarily cover everything. And so it's wonderful when people can say, hey, I actually was thinking about this. Do you mind talking about it? And we'll have a ton of time at the end to run through some questions. Other things, speak from an I place. We won't be speaking on behalf of the communities or the clients that we work with. Please feel free to make space for others to speak, but take space too. You have this really cool comments chat thingy majiggy that I've been told that you can use GIFs and things on. So have at it. If you have an insight, if you have an aha, if you have a question, if you have a challenge, feel free to throw that all in the chat because I will be looking at those. And I think, again, that's going to make this the most engaging and big value add for all of you. And definitely put your questions in the chat. I'll be asking you a couple of times to put questions in the chat. And be thinking, is there anything else you want from me in terms of how to make this a value add and something that you felt like was a good part of your day. I can talk fast. I get very excited about imagination work. And so if I start kind of blithering on, please do feel free to put in the chat, ask Erin to slow down, and I will take a breath and meditate. And be thinking about what you want from each other in terms of how you want each other to show up in this space. And if there's anything that you use in your own agreements around how you show up into spaces, please feel free to drop that in the chat. I am always looking for new insights. Next slide. So let's talk about language. You know, whenever you're starting to kick off some work, I think it's so important that we get super clear on when you use a word, what does that word mean? Next slide. Imagination. Most people, when I say imagination, they think Willy Wonka. They think Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. They think Disney or Pixar. But I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about something that's over there or removed. Imagination is really the thinking mind. It's the power of framing a mental image of something that is not present in front of us. So anytime that we're asking someone about change or thinking about something that doesn't exist at all, or maybe not exist in its current format, then fundamentally we're asking them to use their imagination. So here's a definition from Merriam-Webster: the act or power of forming a mental image of something not present to the senses or never before wholly perceived in reality. When I say imagination, that's what I'm going to be referring to. Not Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but fundamentally the fact that we're all working toward creating worlds that many of us have not seen, some of us have never seen. So we have to use our imagination to get to that space, right? To perceive something that hasn't really wholly been perceived before. And then when I talk about North Star, I'm talking about a landmark. I'm talking about something that intimates the direction that we need to be working toward to get toward the world or that we want to see at the end of doing all the work that we're doing. It's a phenomenon that helps us find our way. And I'll talk a little bit more about what it looks like to find your North Star, that thing that guides each of you and your teams and the work that you're doing. And then what it looks like to make sure that you're following and using that North Star. To be clear, I think innovation and imagination often tend to get conflated. So I always feel it's important to make clear, I don't see them as the same thing. A lot of people will say innovation in a way that is supposed to be a stand-in for imagination. Innovation for me, and according to the definition, is a process. You know, it's a way of thinking of new ideas. Imagination is the playground that enriches us, that allows us to go through those processes. It's like the fodder, you know, it's a thing that feeds us, that allows us to do that innovative process and then come up with those new ideas. So I see them a little bit differently. I just wanted to make that clear because some people can see those as the same thing. Next slide. So the importance. Why am I talking about all of this? I think it's important to talk about the importance. Next slide. So take a few seconds to think about a time where you imagined something and something happened very similar to, or maybe exactly like that thing. For some examples, it may be meeting a partner. It may be shooting the winning shot in a basketball game. It could be, what else could it? Getting a job. Maybe there was like a really dope job that you, or an industry that you thought, man, if I could just get in that. And then things kind of fell into place and you were able to get in that. But just think of something that you imagined and it actually happened. And if you want, please feel free to share that in the chat, because I always think it's interesting to see examples from other people of how that's played out. I bring this up because there's power in seeing, there's power in what we see and power in what we believe. If we're working with businesses and business owners to solve really intractable problems, we have to believe that it's possible. You know, our action follows our belief. Our action follows our vision. And so we have to start envisioning what these shifts look like as we talk about what does it look like to create these worlds where we don't have to keep doing the work that we're doing. So that's some of the importance, I think, of just making sure that we're doing that. Something else to be thinking about is what are you seeing 2 years in now? We're in the pandemic, 2 years in. What are you seeing with classmates, with friends, with family, colleagues? Again, feel free to place that in the chat. Like, what are you seeing come up for them? What are you seeing them experience? How are you seeing them feel? I know for myself, I'm seeing a lot of hopelessness, frustration. Burnout is probably, the word for 2021, exhaustion. I'm seeing a lot of folks give up. I'm seeing a lot of folks dig in too, but I'm seeing a lot around just being tired. And so one of the other things about imagination is that it allows us to kind of see beyond, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And I love this scholarship. I've actually had that happen as well in terms of something that happened for me the way that I wanted it to. And, money coming in towards education is always an amazing thing to manifest. So congratulations on that. Next slide. And keep putting them in the chat if you come up with things, because I'll circle back to some of these. So as far as other reasons why imagination is so important is that, I want to make sure I go through. Yeah, I'll talk through this. Another reason why imagination is important is it's hard for people to perform. It's hard for people to do things when they don't understand the purpose. Think about a time where someone asked you to do something and you weren't entirely sure why. It could be a parent and you say, why am I doing this? And they say, because I told you so, right? It could be a boss that's asking you to do something and you're not sure on the connection. You're not sure how it aligns with who you are. And think about how you felt when that happened. Did you feel resentful? Did you feel angry? Did you feel unseen? Did you feel unacknowledged? Because the exact same things happen in our communities. When we go into the community and ask people to just go right away into solving a problem without really directing it back toward their purpose, individually what they feel is important to them and their values, a lot of folks can have negative reactions. And I've seen people who do charrettes and different really cool community activities and be really surprised when people weren't necessarily here for the results that came out of it. And I believe that's because, yeah, you tapped into their imagination, but you didn't tie that back to the things that mattered to them. So imagination is a bridge of them being able to figure that out and being able to make those tie connections themselves. Also, if we don't use our imagination, we end up replicating the things that have already happened. If we don't try to perceive something that we've never perceived before, then we do what we're doing currently, and that doesn't get us anywhere. And something that I really love about imagination is it pushes us out of our circumstances and some of that hopelessness and despondency I was talking about. So I've worked in communities absolutely where people were like, listen, this is how it's been for 50 years. This is how it's been for 75, maybe 100 years. It's not going to change, right? Nothing's going to change. And what imagination does is it allows me to tap into their esteem for themselves and their community. It allows me to tap into their autonomy, their self-determination, because I can say, all right, just dream with me. I love to say that. I learned that from Ephraim here in Houston, Texas. He says, I'm a dreamer, dream with me. So let's dream. What would it look like for you to live in a world where, or how would the world look if you felt loved, if you felt safe, if you felt like you could thrive? And imagine why that isn't happening now. Why don't you have that? Why shouldn't you have that? And what would it look like for you to have that? And then what slowly can happen is, people are kind of like, oh, why don't I have that? Or they can get really excited because they really start thinking about what it could look like if we were to collectively create this world where they felt safe and seen and loved, and as if they had the ability to thrive. And so imagination, perceiving the thing that we've never perceived, allows us to kind of shake ourselves out of what is happening currently and put ourselves into a space where we get excited because we know what can be. We know what can exist, and it's a matter of working toward what can exist. Are there any other reasons that you all can think of in terms of why imagination might be important? You might have your own reasons in terms of why imagination might be important. So please feel free to share those in the chat. Take a few seconds to kind of think about them. I'll also share that as we talk about dismantling institutions and structures and all kinds of different things that are not serving us and technically never have, to what end? I always ask people, what's the game plan? So we dismantle it, and then what? Are we rebuilding based off what we've seen? We've got to have had that imagination to be thinking, all right, we've dismantled it, and now what's this next iteration, this next horizon that we're building towards, and how does that end up looking? Maintaining hope, yeah. Hope is key right now, especially with everything that's going in. So thank you, Caitlin, for that. Next slide. And definitely keep thinking of reasons, because the reasons I've listed are the reasons that I've seen, but you in your own communities and the work that each of you are doing may have your own reasons for why imagination may be so important. And the same is true for the North Star. So story time, brief story. And this is just to see how many of you have had this experience. How many of us maybe we were going to a friend's house, maybe we were going to a new bar. Now, naturally, this was before the world shut down, but and it was maybe a new development. It was something that had just been created. I know that I have, and I'm not someone that's very good about checking the whole route. So I'm 5 minutes out from where I'm thinking I'm supposed to be, and I notice the dot in Google is in the middle of a field, and I'm thinking, well, that can't be right because I'm going to a house, so I shouldn't be in the middle of a field. Sure enough, I get there, and it's a field and a bayou, and it's naturally not where I was supposed to be. And where I was supposed to be was much further along. I use that story because when we're going to new territories, when we are going to new places, oftentimes people want to bring a map. They want to follow a map, something that someone else charted or perceived. And a map oftentimes it doesn't fit for that space. We have to be able to wayfind. And you may be familiar with wayfinding. You may do things in forestry or hiking or camping, and so wayfinding comes up. You may know about the ancient roots of wayfinding, indigenous and aboriginal populations in Canada, aboriginal populations and indigenous populations in Australia, wayfinding that's in the Pacific Islands. There's just many indigenous and aboriginal who have amazing abilities to look at the position of the sun and the direction of the grass, and how the shade looks, and be able to orient themselves to the environment and figure out where they need to go. And the reason why that's important is because, one, if we're going to a new space, a map may not fit. So we need to be able to kind of read the cues of what's going on around us and then navigate. And that's where that North Star comes into play. But also, let's say we're following our map and there's a roadblock. There's something there and the map is like, no, but this is the way. You got to go this way. Well, we can't go that way. And so what wayfinding does is it removes us from having to commit to very specific routes to where we can look back and say, all right, we can't go this way. So let's look around at our environment. All right, so if we try to get there, if we go around here, maybe we redirect there. That was key for COVID, right? There was very specific ways a lot of people were doing impacts that they couldn't do anymore. And so what did it look like to step back, look at your environment and say, all right, let's figure out what the new routes are. There's a story I was reading about a population in North Africa, and I forget what country, but it was an explorer colonizer who was there, and he was writing about the journey. And he mentioned how astounded he was that there were these dunes that they couldn't pass in their route. And yet the nomadic tribe that he was walking with, they were able to almost zigzag out completely out the way. And he was certain they were lost. They were not going to find their way. And sure enough, in shorter time, they got to where they were trying to go. And he was blown away because the European tools that he was familiar with, he felt like they never would have been able to do that. But that's what wayfinding does, is if there's something in our way, we don't have to get committed to that way. We're able to, no matter what route we take, find ourselves to where we're trying to go. So that's what we want to talk about is what does it look like for you all to wayfind? That's going to be what's bridging those divides to say, all right, we can't do this way, or this way isn't appropriate, or maybe we're learning this way was actually kind of oppressive and not the way that needed to be. What does it look to go in a different way? All right, next slide. Intentions. I want to be clear. Imagination is not a magic wand. This is not a bippity boppity boop moment for those of you who are Disney fans. And it's not a panacea. So I don't want to pretend like it is, but again, it is a way to bridge. Something else to keep in mind is that imagination is something that has been under attack for centuries. When you think about it's really hard to control a population that can imagine better for themselves, that can see better for themselves. And so one of the first things that happens when you have oppressive forces is they kill people's imaginations. And so the reason that I bring this up is because you may be working with communities or individuals whose imaginations aren't as rich, as they might otherwise be. I work with a lot of communities where when I go in, they're like, I don't have an imagination, which I know is not the case. But that's what they believe. And so just keep in mind, this is slow work. This is iterative work. This is work that you kind of got to keep coming at. And that it's going to take time. It's going to take time for them to build trust. It's going to take time for them to build comfort. It's going to take time to drop into that vulnerability. But it does end up happening, right? So just know that it's something that's not a one and done, but this is something that has to be built up and worked through over time. Again, imagination is also not to be manipulative and say, hey, here's my discovery, or this is what I want to do. You should come along with me. It's, again, a way to bridge. It's to say, all right, this is the world that I'm trying to create, and this is what I'm trying to do to get there. What is the world you're trying to create? And how are you trying to get there? And how do we bridge that? What does it look like to connect those dots so that we can meld and create these worlds together, right? And something that makes imagination so magical, at least to me, and unlike, framework from Harvard Business School here or whatever the big elite school in Canada is here, is that it's really informed by our experiences, our perspective, our lived experience. So please, 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 as Jill Scott would say, feel free to put your spices on it, your seasonings on it. I'm giving you a general understanding of what it is that I do as I do imagination, but each of you will have expertise that I do not have. And we'll need to adapt it for populations that I've never met. So the intention is for you to take this and run with it. Use your imagination to be cheesy. So don't feel like this is something that has to be emulated or replicated. The point is to get you thinking imaginatively about imagination so that you can do whatever needs to be done with the communities that you're working with. And it's just an introduction. So please continue to look into it. Just making sure. Changing status quo. I actually have that in my mission statement. Said he, I hope I pronounced your name right. So I love that. It's absolutely about changing status quo and really thinking about what's the new status quo? Do we want a status quo? It's challenging. It's asking those questions. It's taking us out, right? And thinking differently. Thank you for sharing that. Next slide. So I'll end the spiel just to say, please, please, please be thinking of questions because we'll have a good amount of time toward the end. And so that could be, how do I translate imagination tools for the population that I'm working with? How would I translate what Erin talked about on this specific project? Or, Erin, I've had this issue come up, or this challenge, we don't want to say issue, this challenge come up with this population that I was working with. What tools might you suggest that I use with them? Or like tool, maybe I need just adapt for the folks that I'm working with. What might that look like? Or it may be your experience and you would just want to make sure that the tools jive with your own experience. It may be that the tools are reminiscent of something that you found to be oppressive. I'm still unlearning. And so if that's the case, let's talk about how to make this freer, right? So please, 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 please come up with questions. Put them in the chat as we go along, as they come up. We'll circle back to them, but also feel free to ask at the end when we have the question and answer. Next slide. So the work, I'll go a little bit more into like when I'm saying imagination work and doing the work, what does that look like for you all and how might you facilitate that with the work that you all are doing in the communities that you're working in? Next slide. So part of the work, I wouldn't even say before the work, part of the work that really gets forgotten, and I think is just as important, if not really more important than the work itself, is we have to create the conditions. We have to create the environment that allows people to do the imagination work, to drop into their imaginations, to trust us enough to be able to bridge those divides, right? Because if we don't create the right container for that, what ends up happening is we have more division. People get defensive. They kind of, shrink up. I've seen spaces where because that environment, that space wasn't cultivated in a way that allowed people to open up and be expansive. People had their arms crossed and they were on their phone and just distance. And then you're not going to bridge too many gaps when that's happening. And so ways to create the conditions that allow for imagination. And part of the work is, one, be thinking about how you're building trust and relationships. Trust and relationships is essential to doing this work. Our imagination, if you think about it, is the key to really our soul. That sounds so cheesy, but that's the only thing I can think of. It's the key to our soul. It's the key to what motivates us. It's the key to what's hurt us. It's the key to what we're afraid of. It's the key to, our hopes and dreams. So imagination is actually very, very vulnerable when you think about it. When you ask people to drop into and to use their imagination, it's an incredibly vulnerable experience, especially when you have them gather and do it. And the other thing we have to think about psychologically is we're talking oftentimes about populations that have been demeaned, diminished, demoted, all the D's. Everything has been done to them. And so when we talk about thinking about a world where they could be happy, some people don't want to set themselves up for that hurt. They're like, I don't, that's something that I don't think can happen. And I don't want to set myself up to be disappointed again. And so we've got to build the trust in the relationships with themselves and with each other to really trust that we can do this, and then, connect the dots to what that looks like collectively. Be reassuring and reinforcing. And so people are going to think that they're doing imagination work wrong. And it sounds funny. You're like, how would that be? But I'm telling you that as you do the work that you're going to do in some of the exercises I'm going to suggest, people will insist that they're doing it wrong. It's modern schooling. It's just how things are these days. I've had people do it with me. Help people really find their way so that they can drop in. For anyone that's taken yoga, then you've definitely seen this, where you have the really cool instructor. The best instructors, when they tell you to take a new pose, they know exactly what preemptory instructions to give you so that you're not in your head, right? So they're like, all right, when you hit this pose, make sure you square your hips, make sure you're breathing, make sure you open up your mouth, or make sure you do this, make sure you don't do this. They're telling you all of this so that you're not in your head and you're not opening your eyes and like, wait, am I doing the right thing? Am I where I'm supposed to be? Did I mess this up? But that you're able to really just kind of close your eyes and drop in. That's exactly what you want when you're doing this type of work with folks, or really any work, is you want to create such a safe environment because you've reassured and reinforced people so well that they can really just kind of drop in and not be worried about doing things wrong. Another example is hiking. I don't know how many of you have been on hiking trails. In Canada, I've been on some amazing hiking trails. And I've been on one where the trail markers were not there, and was certain that was how it was going to end for me. It was finding my body in Canada with a Cliff Bar wrapper. So, and that was because I wasn't reassured. I didn't know, like, where am I supposed to go? What is this supposed to look like? This is a different type of wilderness from Houston, Texas. And so be thinking about yourselves like trail markers, right? If you drop little trail markers for people and let them know along the way what's going on, then they don't get freaked out saying, okay, what's happening next? Or they don't try to anticipate, or they don't try to get defensive, but they can really just kind of drop into whatever it is that you're doing with them. So be reinforcing and reassuring. And the way this can look is when I'm doing an exercise with people, I say, listen, you may feel some resistance. You may ask yourself some questions. You may challenge yourself. You may get angry at me. That's all supposed to happen, so that they know, listen, if your mind blanks, that's typical. The way in which we live in this world, that's going to happen. Just keep going at it. Or you may feel some resistance, sit with it, and just know that we need to keep going. And then lastly, create rituals or ceremonies. This is especially important with Zoom, because it's really hard for me to concentrate with food on the stove and lawnmower outside and a pile of mail here. I don't have a pile of mail, but I may have a pile of mail here. Like, it's really hard to drop in. So I've really relied on rituals and ceremonies to be working with people. And so how that may look is candles. When I'm working with a small group, I love buying them candles because they can light the candle, and that just kind of designates that we're in our zone, even if they're in the middle of pandemonium in their home. It could be having everyone take a collective breath. It could be having everyone recite something. Dining for Women, a nonprofit that I'm a member of, every dinner that we come to get, or before, I don't do it now, but every dinner we would have coming together, we would recite this little intention that talked about why we were coming together and what we were doing and keeping these women that we were going to learn about in our hearts. And it was a wonderful way to just gather, and we would recite it together to drop into that moment because it was the official marking of what we were doing. So think about, as you're doing imagination work, or really the work you do in general, what are ceremonies that you can create that allow people to really drop in? Is it a way to transition them into the work and a way to transition them out, like a graduation? Or is it just a way to transition them into the space if they're on Zoom to say, listen, for the hour that I have you opened up your journal, this is where we're at. And this is what we're dropping into. And if you have other rituals that you've done, definitely feel free to drop those in the chat. I'm always looking for different rituals to do with folks, but I find that kind of stuff is super important for imagination. Next slide. In terms of how the tools to use for some of the imagination work I'm going to talk about shortly, different things I find really important that I wanted to point out. I find imagination work requires people be able to come back in different ways at different times. So definitely have things set up using like Miro, a whiteboard, Miro, Mural. It's owned by Facebook. I understand. However, it is a good platform for a whiteboard. I've had to read through it. There's Google Docs, of course. There's all kinds of whiteboards really that exist now with COVID, but have different ways for people to drop into the work that you're doing before. So you may send them a question or a prompt and say, hey, put it on the board, and we'll cover a couple of them when we come together. And then you may have people come together and do something, and then you allow them to come back. I'm a marinator. So if you ask me to do something in the meeting, I'm going to get belligerent, which I know is funny for a facilitator. I try not to be a butthead about it because I'm a facilitator, but I don't do well on the spot. I need some time to marinate and think about it. So I'm going to think about it, but then I'll come back with something super rich afterwards. And so I love to have different documents or things open that people just can keep coming back to as their imagination's deeper, or maybe as they've rested. Sleep does amazing things for imagination. So maybe if they've gone to bed and woke up the next morning, they'll have ideas. So have ways for people to do that. Be thinking about, speaking of rest, various forms of rest, building in breaks, but also building in time for people's minds to wander, for them to doodle. It seems kind of counterintuitive because we try to squeeze so much into the sessions we have. I'm finding more and more, especially with all the Zooms, that's tricky for folks. And so when I build in time to doodle or to just kind of have their minds wander, I find that I get much richer responses from folks. So be thinking about how you can strategically build in rest. Or you may schedule things to where they break up. So you have something on a Tuesday, let people sleep Tuesday evening, and then do it again on Wednesday. Because I've had some success with that. Visuals are helpful, and they help people think through, see a little bit differently what they're doing. I'm a huge fan of story prompts. We're meaning-making animals. We're storytelling animals. And so what I might do is I won't take a story directly, but I may riff off of a fairy tale, Hansel and Gretel, something like that, and take out major plots or major characters and allow them to fill that in. It's fascinating what you get back. So when I'm working with a community, I may take a story that they may be somewhat familiar with, or create my own story. And I want to see, who do they think the villain is? Who do they think the villain is in that community? What's the barrier in that community? Who do they believe the hero is? What do they think that hero's journey is? It allows people, it's a unique way to get to things subconsciously that people may not necessarily even be aware of. And another way of tapping into that imagination, right? So it's something I've had a lot of success with that's been really fun. I mentioned creating rituals. Create safety and allow people to give themselves permission. Brene Brown, in one of her books, which I can't remember because I have all of them, talks about writing herself a permission slip. I think she was talking about wanting to take more walks because she does rest. She does better in the work that she's doing if she's able to take walks. But she would get guilty, about productivity, and I don't have time for walks. So she writes herself a permission slip, literally, and puts it somewhere and then takes the walk. I thought that was really dumb when I read it. I'll be honest. I was like, But then that resistance, we sat with it. I said, well, let me try it. And I needed to take a walk, wrote a permission slip. It actually felt very good. I don't know. So if you have people that you can tell are kind of distracted, they're worried about midterms or everything that's going on, have them write themselves a permission slip to just kind of have that moment with you, or have the session or whatever it is that you're working on, and see what the results are. It may not work for everybody, but I was really surprised. Let's see what else. Please keep, and so I bring all this up because think of it as a marathon. It's really difficult. There's prep, I guess is what I'm getting at. there's very few of us who would be able to just walk up on the New York Marathon and run it. I can barely run down the block, so I know I can't run a marathon. There's prep that we've got to do to make sure we don't hurt ourselves, to make sure we don't hurt other people, to make sure that we actually are able to complete the marathon. And so the creating the conditions and the tools, I bring this up because it's really important to make sure that we've done that prep to hold the space for the imagination work. And what I want to carry across is the exercises is not even the thing. It's the conditions that you create around the exercises and the activities that you're doing with folks that's going to make it or break it. You can do a great job of facilitating an activity, but if you didn't have the right technology set up to document that and to reflect it back to people, if you didn't really tap into them, if you didn't really connect the dots to what matters to them, then the activity just becomes an activity and it doesn't become the catalyst for transformative change. It's kind of what I'm carrying across. And celebrate is another tool that I would definitely keep in mind. I also love Brene Brown. She is secretly my bestie. And she doesn't know it yet. So I'm glad to see that there's another fan on. Next slide. The work. I know you're like, when do we get to the work? Here's the work that I mean, all of that was the work, but these are specifically what I'm thinking about. And this is just a few because I felt like I wanted to respect time and there's so much that can be done. But one, visioning. And you may say, duh, we already do visioning. Okay, how do you do the visioning? The reason I bring up the visioning is because you would be surprised how many people don't get clear from the get and how many folks are working on impact projects and are talking past each other. I have yet to meet a client or community that were actually clear on what each person meant when they said they wanted to be successful, when they said they wanted to create an equitable world, when they said that they wanted to get, even if they say, oh, we want to make sure that we all thrive. What thriving looks like for me is probably not what thriving looks like for you. And so what happens, right, in terms of divides, we go in with our preconceived notion of what thriving looks like. And then you don't do what I think relates to my definition of thrive. And I'm like, why is she sabotaging? Why is she said she was team Aaron. Why is she doing what she's doing? And she's looking at me crazy. Like, why is she doing what she's doing? You got to get clear from the get. What does the world look like? When in terms of what everyone's thinking and where do they want to go? Where does everyone want to go? And don't just have them say, I want to feel good. It needs to be visceral. And that's what the visioning, that's what I'm saying is, one of the prompts I do is it's 2060. Your organization is wrapping up. It's winding down. You've done the thing. What does that look like? Or write a newspaper article telling me about this event in 5 years from now. And, I need the senses. I want the 5 senses. I want you to talk about that. I want you to get into super detail. What exists, what doesn't exist, all of that. I mean, to get really, really rich, because what people typically find is that they are on totally different platitudes in terms of what that vision looked like, but that's good. Because now we can talk about what does it look like to make that collective. But we got to know what the differences are. We got to know that the fact that our vision may be looking a little bit different to create that collective vision. And now we can collectively work toward that collective vision. Is there anything else I want to say on this? And like I said, if you can get everyone clear on the vision, you can build the consensus that allows you to bridge the gaps, the divides. The divides almost always come from the what. We get so hung up on the things that we're doing. And the things that we're doing, going back to wayfinding, they may go away tomorrow. We got to focus on why we're doing it. Get super clear on that why. What does the world look like when we're done doing what we do? And then let's reverse engineer that and get super clear on connecting to that, but using the wayfinding. And we'll talk about that in just a sec. Thinking differently is really important also for when we talk about using our imagination. So there's a concept called lateral thinking. I won't say it was created, but it was popularized by Edward de Bono. So check him out. And so what happens, think about the way you were taught to do math. Think about the way you were taught to do science. Very vertical. You got to show your work. I never showed my work because I don't do math. But I know I was supposed to show my work. You have your deductive reasoning with your science. And so what ends up happening is when we talk about creating solutions and solving problems to really intractable problems, we're very vertical. And vertical usually tends to replicate what already exists. So we tweak. We may not be super innovative, but we tweak. And what lateral thinking is, it gets us thinking across domains. And it's when you're thinking across domains that things get really, really creative. And I'm actually going to do an example of that with you all here pretty shortly. So I won't say too much more about that. And then North Star, the wayfinding. So that's going back to once you're clear on the vision. So once you all have talked about what does the world look like when we're done doing the work that we're doing, the wayfinding is, okay, how do we get there? What does the world look like now? Like, what are our cues that tell us how we need to start getting to the world that we want to get to? And how are we checking in every once in a while? You know, if you follow those who are nomadic, there's a check-in that they do to say, okay, are we going in the right direction? Yes or no? Oh, no, we had to go off a little bit. How are we reorienting? You know, and so having those processes in place, I have a process called nomads, where you're looking at, you know, where are we at now? What are we navigating? How are we orienting? So how are we checking our environment? How are we making sure that we're going in the right direction? And how are we making sure if we're not going in the right direction that we're reorienting ourselves? What does the movement look like for us? How do we know we've made it? Another reason why visioning is so important. So a lot of people are working on intractable problems, but no one's ever talked about how do we know we've solved the problem? You know, think for yourself. Have you talked about how do we know when we got it? I was going to sing "Looks Like We Made It," but I'm not going to do that. So how do we know that we've made it? And then how do we know when maybe we need to shift again? Because this, you know, it's not a matter of just getting there and then we can just sit back and rest, but maybe we need to keep going, right? Maybe that was the first horizon and we need to go to the second horizon. So what does it look like to do that? And then how do we sustain ourselves? You know, so really thinking about what it looks like to be nomadic. That's what I'm thinking about when I say wayfinding. Next slide. So really quickly, in terms of using the tools, always, always, always connect dots. So if we're doing visioning, if we're doing wayfinding, don't just, again, do the exercise and then not connect the dots back to why these things should matter to the folks that you're working with. This goes back to asking them to do things and they don't understand how it relates to their purpose. The piece that excites and ignites, that gets people really jacked up, is to see, oh, I see myself reflected in this. I see how to get to the things that are important to me in this. And you got to be really intentional and explicit. Don't intimate, don't hint at what may be connecting the dots. Be explicit about having them connect the dots between things that are really powerful and important to them, because that's how you get people engaged. And that's how you get them really wanting to contribute in ways that are meaningful to them. Again, make sure they don't get wrapped up in the what. The what is what divides us. You know, the what, there's different things we can do. We need to make sure that we're clear on the why. What is the world that we're working toward? And when visioning or using imagination, be diligent about challenging the folks that say, well, things will, you know, they'll never be solved. Will always be needed because things will never change. Our actions follow our beliefs. So I have a lot of folks that I've worked with doing imagination work that say, I don't need imagination because things are never going to go away. And I say, now let's imagine, how is that belief showing up in your work? And how might things have changed had you not had that belief, been carrying that belief? And, you know, some people can get belligerent, but a lot of people kind of stops them because it's like, oh, our actions follow our beliefs. So if I don't believe things will ever change, I guarantee you the solutions you're coming up with, the way that you're doing those solutions, the way you're working with people reflect that. If you want to be transformative, you got to be thinking transformatively. And what allows us to do that, to transcend, remember, the things wholly unperceived, is to use our imagination. Remember, the North Star is not a static destination. It's a tool for finding our way around. So the North Star is not something that we just set and we say, all right, autopilot, right? That goes back to the mapping. It's something that we look at and then we're constantly checking for it. And I love it because what it does is it means there's no right or wrong. It just means that, oh, we got a little off course. All right, let's get back on course. You know, it allows us to experiment. It allows us to try things. It allows us to take the action and not have to feel like we have to pre-plan. Because if we're looking periodically to see, can we still see that star? Oh, no, we can't. All right, we need to go. Then you don't have to worry about getting too far off course. So it allows us to be experimental and do some of the things like lean and other things that you hear about. And if people struggle with visioning or imagination, just please be rest assured that it's showing up in their work. So some people will say, this is a luxury. I don't have the luxury to imagine. You don't have the luxury not to imagine. We're not getting where you're trying to go if we're not using our imagination. So be patient and just say, however you show up. If all you can do is imagine something that gets us to next Tuesday, let's do that. That's imagination. We're not at Tuesday yet, right? Wholly unperceived. And then maybe we get to 2023. And then maybe we get to 5 years from now. And then we get to 10 years from now. So just meet people where they are and go from there. Next slide. So before I go into this, I want to make sure I'm reading the notes. Her podcast is fire. I don't listen to podcasts as much as I should, but I have heard this and I've seen snippets on her Instagram. Without vision, we lose our bearing. We absolutely lose our bearing. If you don't stand for something, you fall for everything is the saying. So, if we're not super duper clear, at least on where we're trying to go. And the vision, again, I think where people get hung up is they try to treat vision as something static. That's why the wayfinding is so important. It's not a matter of just coming up with a vision and saying, all right, we got to go for it. It's saying, this is my vision for the moment. And then I'm going to go over here and I'm going to check my surroundings again. Oh, maybe my vision needs to change, right? But I have to have clarity on that vision because I won't know that I'm not there unless I had an idea of what there was, if that makes sense. Speaking of, that was a great segue, Edna. Visioning example. So I'm going to take you through a couple of exercises. Please bear with me, you introverts, because there's some people who I know are just like, I don't want to do any thinking exercises. But I think it's helpful to see why this is important. Hopefully for you to see why this is important. So take 1 to 2 minutes and think about, what is your vision for EWB? It could be whatever. I'm not going to hamstring you on this. And if a few of you or all of you could share that vision in the chat, that would be great. But just think about, what is my vision for this organization? And then share that in the chat. I'll shut up for a second and give you some time to think about that. And then if you feel called to, share it in the chat. So I'll give you a couple more seconds to think about, what is your vision for EWB? And just like write that down, put it in your notes app. Just record it in some way of what your vision is. Doesn't have to be profound. I always tell my clients, half thoughts are welcome. You may not have something super profound or super clear, but half thoughts are always welcome. To better the lives of as many people as possible. Very general is welcome too. I think that's wonderful. Thank you. To better the lives of as many people as possible. I think that's a great vision. So I will let you all wrap up your vision for EWB. And just see, what does the vision look like? Next slide. For my chapter specifically, Ryan says, which is currently not super well established yet, it would be growing into a larger community where we have many different people contributing ideas to make the world a better place. Absolutely. Thank you, Ryan. Connecting students to local community organizations. Another important one. These are great visions. So try that again. This time, using that prompt I said earlier. It's 2060, and the board of EWB, or in the case of Ryan, your chapter, is wrapping up. You're celebrating. You have solved all the problems in the world. Not really, but let's say you have, or at least in your community, you've solved the problems in your community. Mission accomplished. How does the world look? How does the world look when you've done the thing that you came to do? What does it look like? What exists? What doesn't exist? What gaps are filled? What indicators are there that tell you that you've accomplished a thing? It's 2060, EWB is wrapping up, or your chapter is wrapping up. You've done the thing. How does the world look? Take 1 to 3 minutes and write that out. You're celebrating. What would cause you and your chapter or the organization EWB to be celebrating? And then if you feel called, definitely feel free to share that in chat. If yours varies differently, if you shared and it's dramatically or just different in any way, it doesn't have to be dramatic, then also feel free to share that. I'll give you a couple more seconds. 2060, everything in that community has been solved. How does the world look? I see EWB community. Strong communities and social institutions exist across the globe. No one is barred from exploring, participating, and creating. I love that. I am from Africa. I want to connect and learn about a different culture aside from what I see and read on the internet. Super important here. Ryan says the world is a much more equitable place. All industries are sustainable and run without exploitation. There's no country left behind. So this is the interesting shift. And this is why I say visioning, just being really explicit and clear and strategic in our visioning is so important. What can tend to happen with that first example, where it's, hey, what's your vision? We do tend to come up with much broader things. I want to change the world. I want to make the world a greater place. I want to help people feel loved, which are all amazing visions, but they're super difficult. They're super difficult in terms of executing on. And that's where those divides come up. Because when we talk about, I want everyone to feel loved, there is no more divergent thing than love. So what does this mean? Like, what does that end up meaning? But notice, so Ryan, I use yours as an example, but if we ask, you've already solved the problem. How does the world look? Now we're focusing, the world is a much more equitable place. All industries are sustainable and run without exploitation. And, you might with more time have even refined it more than that. Now we got something to pin on, right? It's like, oh, so how do we work backwards? And then the North Star, what that may be is, all right, is what we're doing leading to companies being more sustainable, industries being more sustainable? Is what we're doing allowing people to ease out of exploitation? Is what we're doing leading to equity, which is totally different than I want to create a better world. Hopefully y'all can see the difference, right? So it makes it easier in terms of bridging those divides, because now I have a clear picture. Oh, Ryan, so when you're talking about this is why you do the work. Now I couldn't really see it when you said, I want to create a better world, because my idea of creating a better world is totally different than your way of creating a better world. But if this is it, I can see this, and I actually would love to be in an equitable world where industries are sustainable and there's no exploitation. How do we end up doing that? So hopefully that made sense. I see there's some others that have come through. New community-made partnerships. Education and international development would be integrated into technical programs to train students to think in that way. That makes complete sense. Something very visceral, because now it's like, all right, is what we're doing getting to that point? And then as you may see, you're veering off, and then like, oh, no, we need to come back again. So, hopefully that in your own that you did, even those who didn't share, you might see a difference between the vision that you had for the organization when I just say, hey, what's your vision? And the vision when I say, let's imagine you've already done it. You've accomplished the thing. What are you seeing in that world? And what I would do if I was doing this exercise with you all in terms of facilitation is I would say, first of all, you're going to have something that comes up and say, we never will solve the problem. Squash that. I'm telling you, you solved it. It's 2060 and you solved it, right? So that's not even an issue. So let's talk about how does that world look, and understand that I'm not committing to you. I'm not making you write that in blood. I'm just curious how that world looks for you right now. And then we can start kind of get going on reverse engineering what it looks like to get there and choosing a North Star that makes sure that that world actually gets created. So thank you so much for those who shared. We're gonna have another example where you can share. So hopefully that's warmed us up. Next slide, please. So lateral thinking is my favorite. I've had such success with lateral thinking. I can't even explain it. So in terms of an exercise to get you thinking more creatively, which I, in hindsight, probably should have done before the vision, but that's what facilitation is, right? So here we go. You're learning real time. Here's the prompt. A business owner is struggling to create a technology that brings their community together. Come up with 1 or 3 ideas for what they could create, right? So just take a couple of minutes, 1 to 2 minutes. You have a business owner that has come to you all and they said, listen, our community is fractured. We're not getting along. No one knows one another. I want to create something with my business that brings us all together. And you're brainstorming with them as a thought partner. What are 1 to 2 3 ideas that you would come up with. Doesn't have to be profound. Could be silly. I'm asking you off the top of your head, but just come up with a few. And if you feel called, feel free to share them in the chat. I'll give you a couple more seconds to come up with some ideas. You could say, oh, let's create an app that everyone agrees on a space and they go to it, or, whatever the case may be, but just come up with a few ideas. Maybe it's a mobile shelter and it moves. Oh, here we go. Social media platform, competition for kids. Oh, that's actually really cool. Banquet event service. Love it. Thank you. Service good business provides. They could create a space in which people could use that good service together in a more social. Oh, I love it. Yeah, COVID's a little bit tricky, but fingers crossed 2024 is our year. Could create an app to sell their product, create a solid social media platform. Yeah, I mean, the ideas abound, right? So let's try this one more time. Similar vision thinking. Next slide. So same prompt, except come up with 1 to 3 ideas for what they could create using the word blender. You could do this literally based on a blender being involved. You could do this metaphorically, thinking about what a blender does, thinking about how a blender operates, thinking about how a blender looks, but using the word blender. Come up with 1, 2, 3 ideas for how this business owner can create a technology that brings their community together. Just take a couple of minutes. Just now I saw yours too, the teleportation device, which I love. Soon enough. Oh, we already have one, smoothie recipe swaps, which I love. Absolutely. I need more, that's for sure. Blender created drinks for everyone. Absolutely. Some possibly of the alcoholic nature, who knows? So take a couple more minutes. Using the word blender, what are some ideas for what this entrepreneur, this business owner can do? Caitlin, I love this. Blenders, a social platform that can let people blend ideas together. You may want to run and patent that. That's a wonderful idea. Inviting people from different cultures together. So literally blending. Blender bike challenges, smoothies, milkshakes, fun. Oh, I love that. I need both, a blender and I need to get on my bike more. So there's that. Create the largest blender in the world to get into the newspaper, which is a great idea. Get a Guinness? You know what I mean. A platform connecting people to share excess ingredients to blend cuisines. Oh, I love that. See, so I'm trying not to gush. I'm trying not to yell. But you see how different it is? You see the ideas. I've done this with some clients and we've used the word pencil and they've come up with the most profound things I have ever heard just from the word pencil. So this exercise, for those who are interested, is called random word entry. I actually didn't bring them in front of me. I had a mentor. She created popsicle sticks and of a program I was part of. And what we do is you would pull popsicle sticks with nouns on them. So I would pull a popsicle stick and it may say elephant. I would pull a popsicle stick and it may say pencil. But you put a word on there, pull it, and then you say, all right, let's brainstorm strategy, or let's brainstorm an approach. Let's brainstorm ideas around this word. And it just takes people totally outside. Like, how many of us would have thought of some of the things that we thought of just now if we hadn't have had the word blender? And so that's another one of those, when we talk about imagination, one, it's fun. I've had some of the folks who were some of the biggest stalwarts and just came in with the most sour faces, get very excited when they've done this. And ironically, that word was mouse. So I was a little nervous when that one got pulled, but they came up with some great stuff. So it excites people. People are like, oh, you could do this and you could do that. I noticed the pace this time was a little bit different, right, than it was the first time. But also, it really and truly gets us thinking differently. And I don't do this just to be fun or funny. These ideas are ideas that you can implement. You know, even the thing around the biggest blender, like, what is something around that we can actually do that would be really, really cool? And I've had clients implement based on their ideas that came out of their lateral thinking. So definitely feel free to use that one if you're looking for ways to get the folks that you're working with to use their imagination, and you want to directly tie it to strategy or approaches or something that you're doing, and just kind of get them excited. Especially those of you that mentioned your chapter and maybe thinking about, what does it look like to get our chapter moving and get them established? Like, what are some strategies? You may run a lateral thinking exercise, just kind of get people excited and thinking a little bit differently. There's a hospital nearby, so I apologize for the constant sirens, by the way. Houston is not as dangerous as it sounds right now. Next slide, please. Summarizing. So recapping kind of what we've talked about. You know, as you are talking about getting folks excited and energized and wanting to contribute, it's important to talk about the North Star early. I hope I've gotten that across. We need to know, where are y'all trying to go? What is your vision and what is their vision? And then how do we collectively bring these together? Because that's what you have to remind everyone when they're trying to get things done and it gets tough. You know, what keeps people, I think I saw this, you know, hope keeps people going. Absolutely. What keeps people trudging through is that world that they know can be. So if we don't have that thing that we're holding on to when we're encountering the gatekeepers and the government institutions and the people who are going to give us the funding, if we don't have that thing, then it's easier, one, to pivot. I'm writing now about how pivot can actually be a really bad thing. We move because we're not really standing for something, right? So we're like, ooh, maybe we need to adjust. And we end up adjusting around those people and not about the change that we're trying to make. So get clear on that North Star. And the way to get clear on that North Star is to do that visioning and understand what that world looks like. Tap into the imagination. You know, that's kind of been the crux of today, but we have to be able to see what's never existed before to transform. Otherwise, we're only going to be replicating what we've already had and seen in existence currently. And then, much like painting or playing sports or anything else that requires action, you know, tapping into the imagination requires prep. It requires thinking about, what are the spaces that we're creating? There's a whole paradigm around brave spaces versus safe spaces. You know, so are we creating brave spaces for people to really challenge and really think differently, for conflict to be generative and not necessarily something degenerative? But we are allowing also people to be safe in their bodies. Are we allowing them to give themselves permission? Are we allowing them to build trust to where they can trust us with their dreams? Because again, talking about our dreams and how we want the world to look can feel very, very vulnerable. Some of you may have felt that yourselves. You may have checked yourself and said, oh no, actually, I would love this world, but that's not going to happen. Like, that's vulnerability coming up, right? And so being aware of those things and planning for and navigating those things and meeting people where they are with those things. Making sure that we're using tools that support that work. Having, you know, the Google Docs or the pages set up so that people can revisit things as they are marinating on them. All of that stuff is going to be super important. Thinking if there's anything else I want to cover. Next slide. So reflections, kind of taking away what we've done, or some of it. What is one ritual or ceremony that you think you can add to your meetings that will really help participants drop into their imagination? You may even do lateral thinking, you know, using Blender. But just maybe take a couple of seconds to think about, what is a ritual or ceremony? If you're doing one, please share, because that would be great to share with the group, and maybe that'll stoke some other ideas. But If not, think of something and then feel free to drop it in the chat. So what is one ritual, ceremony that you can do to really help people drop in? A ritual or ceremony to help people drop into using their imagination and feeling comfortable doing some of this imagination, visioning North Star work. Take a couple more seconds. Oh, I love this. I've never heard this. Roses and thorns, sharing your roses and thorns from the last week to support relationship community building. I love that. And you know what I love about that so much is that one, it's building relationship. Two, it's a check-in, right? So we can see how people are coming into the space and what we need to do maybe in the way that we're facilitating to make sure that we're accommodating for that. But then it's the relationship building. Absolutely. And it's a way of people seeing it's not just me. Because that's one thing that I think is coming up with this pandemic is it can feel isolating and we feel like we're the only ones falling apart and who Zoom is not working for and things aren't updating. And so hearing other people share could be incredibly helpful. Thank you for that. Have a fun group painting on Zoom. I love that. Like I said, I do doodling on my facilitations. I tell people, take out a pencil and we're doodling for 5 minutes. And people look at me nuts, but then they don't want to stop doodling. So it's a great tool. It's a great tool to use. Taking a deep breath before the meeting starts. I always find plant your feet if you feel comfortable, sitting up straight and just taking a deep breath to always be a great opener. It's also one that doesn't freak everyone out because there's some openers that not everyone is there yet. And the deep breath is the most accessible, I find. One of the most, it's not the most, but one of the most accessible for folks. Thank you for that. Bring and share. Absolutely. I've done that one. What is an object? This is the closest to me. What is an object and why did you choose this object? Kind of situation is a great way to get people out of their minds and kind of into their body and thinking creatively and using their imagination. And then I love the idea of a weekly icebreaker that just, is a way for people to get to know one another. And then something else I would want you to sit with as we're talking about taking things away and what this looks like. And then for those of you, we have a lot of time left. So also be thinking about questions, but what is one practice you want to use to open up imaginations? Are you interested in lateral thinking? Are you interested in really doing some visioning work and working with people on understanding what that is and working creatively? Is it the North Star that you think is going to help with imagination? So just kind of take a few seconds to think about, and it may not even be those. It may be some other practices you're familiar with that now that we've talked about imagination, you're like, oh, you know what I could do? I could do this. And I love those because like the roses and thorn, I'm absolutely going to look into that and try that. So thank you. So take a couple of seconds. What is one practice you want to use that you want to walk away with today and say, I'm going to use this to open up people's imaginations in the next meeting that we have? Take a little bit of time. And then if you feel so called, you can place it in the chat. One thing you're going to take away today to open up people's imaginations. I always feel it's helpful to commit to it the day of, because things can get a little hairy when we get back on Monday. Doodling saves the world. I'm just saying. I've had so much success with doodling. Doodling, and you may have done this, but the pipe cleaners. I used to, when COVID wasn't a thing, I saw someone bring pipe cleaners, and I'd seen it, like Harvard and a lot of these other schools that do work around the brain and creativity will put pipe cleaners and things on the tables in the meeting rooms so that people can mess with them. And I worried about them being a distraction, but I did them, and I found that they actually kept people more focused, unless they were building a pipe cleaner fort, in which case you kind of had to shut that down. But yes, Scribble.io absolutely is a great resource, especially with COVID. Visioning exercise, it's a great exercise. And it immediately opens people up to realizing, oh, you know what? We've been talking past each other. And we don't know how often we're talking past one another when we say, oh, I want to create a better world. And how better world for us for someone else may be, not a better world for us. So a couple more seconds thinking about what's a practice that you want to do to open up imaginations. And if you want to add that to the chat, feel free. Remembering wayfinding. Wayfinding creates so much freedom. I can't iterate how much freedom it creates, because it allows people, some of the challenges in the devise I've seen have come up from people thinking they need to get it right. And I try to remind them, if this ain't been solved in millennia, then getting it right doesn't need to be the focus. We just need to transform. And transform doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to hit it spot on the first time. And so, yeah, the wayfinding gives us flexibility, and people are like, oh, and they trust themselves, right? Because they're like, all right, I'm going to learn the skill sets to where I can read the environment, and then I'll be able to make decisions, rather than feeling like I got to go get this MBA or go get this degree or do this job in order to do the work. It creates so much freedom. So that's a great practice if you're talking about opening up imaginations, because then I can focus on the experience, like with the hiking. If it's a trail marker, I can just enjoy the hike. I can drop into the hike. It's when there's no trail marker and it's getting dark and I'm like, oh, wait, what's going on? That things start to get a little hairy. Establishing a goal we want to get to and allowing time to daydream. Daydreaming is great towards that goal and share back. I love daydream. I love that you use that word, giving people space to daydream. Absolutely. How often are we getting permission to daydream? Just think about it, particularly in the spaces that you all are inhabiting. And then particularly with the communities. Think about how often the communities you're working with have been given collective permission to just dream. It's huge. So I thank you all for sharing. Please keep sharing. Like I said, I left a lot of time, which I hope the organizers won't be mad, because I wanted to be able to take questions. And a lot of time I get a lot of questions. Sometimes people want to marinate again. But this is the time. We've got plenty of time left. So please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. If you have a question about how to do a specific tool, if you want more tools, if you have a challenge that you want to hypothetically share, and see if we might, as a collective, come up with some tools that could be helpful. Or if there's a population that you're working with and you want to think about what tools might be great for working with that population, all those questions are welcome. Yes, Justin, my Zooms, I insist people take video off and go outside now. Because I absolutely agree that being outside, I only take calls really this week because I needed to be walking and not sitting at my table staring off into the ether. So does anyone have any questions? Oh, Bernice, have you had moments where you struggled to articulate your vision, especially when working with teams, larger groups, and how have you worked around that? Absolutely. So as I mentioned, most people, you'd be surprised, most people have never been given permission to use their imagination or to think about their vision. I mean, maybe you aren't surprised. I mean, think about what institutions, what organizations, like how many instances have each of you been given an opportunity to daydream, to Justin's point, and to think about your vision and use your imagination? And in fact, how many of you have maybe been chastised or punished for daydreaming, using your imagination, or trying to articulate your vision for what you saw? So vision can actually be very difficult for folks. It can trigger things sometimes. And that's, I mentioned this earlier, sometimes I've got to move into somatic tools, body-oriented tools, because you can see people get kind of tense. They flinch and didn't know that they flinched. And so what can end up happening is I usually try to have to scaffold. I think the 2060 exercise is helpful because I'm not asking you, if you notice, I didn't say, give me a vision, because then that's when people, they start trying to do vision statements and they think it has to be profound and it's got to be, this heady thing. Just tell me what the world looks like. What do you see in your head? I just want to know what you see in your head. And so I scaffolded back. Really, the thing that usually gets people hung up is giving themselves the permission to even dream about what that world would look like, because they've just never been in that space. And sometimes it's painful. And so I hold space for that too. All right, you know what? Let's think about tomorrow. Or let's think about the best day ever. Like the best day you had ever, where you felt seen and heard and you felt like you could rule the world, which is not what we want because we're talking about liberation and freedom, but you get what I'm saying, right? What did that day end up looking like? And we deconstruct that day and pick little pieces out. All right, so what I'm hearing is it's really important for you to feel acknowledged. It's really important for you to feel like you've contributed. It's really important. So let's talk about what that would look like in the world. How would it look in the world for you to feel like you've contributed? What are things that you've done where when you were done, you were like, you know what? I contributed today. And so we scaffold it up, because then people aren't so focused on the answer, or one, on the answer, or two, on being defensive, right? So then that defense mechanism of, I don't want to take the time to try to dream and think about what that looks like, but they're merely focused on my question that I'm asking them. What does it look like for you to contribute? What does it look like for you to, when you talk about thrive, I just want to understand what's in your head. So what does it look like when you say that you're thriving or you want to thrive? How does the world look when it allows you to thrive? We don't even have to talk about 2060. Let's talk about next month, what that would look like. That sort of opens people up. And with larger groups, in terms of articulating vision, I also, to the earlier point, I make it clear that we're not committed. This is not what we're putting in stone and marble and putting it on your wall, and you gotta go with this. This just starts the conversation. This highlights those divides and makes it abundantly clear that when things are happening or when you do certain things, it's not coming, hopefully, from a malintended place, but you're just working toward the vision that you had. And I wasn't clear on what that vision was. And so with larger groups, I actually find it's a little bit easier for them. What can happen with them is they can get hung up on the what again. And you inevitably have a black hat. So you got to be careful of them too. I saw you pop on, Bernice. Where am I with timing? I thought I was keeping track of it, but
no, you're pretty good.
Okay, I want to make sure. All right, Justin, imagining, visioning, blue skying has a potential to turn into an endless exercise. Would love to hear how you determine when it's time to pause and set goals and start acting. Absolutely. That makes complete sense. And I, full disclosure, am an ideas person, so I could talk about this stuff for stinking ever. So usually within the same exercise, it's that dot connection piece, right? So normally how I do this is I start the group talking about what does the world look like? Because I do an opening exercise, but the first thing that we do after that is to talk about so what are we working toward? What's the vision? And I do it that out the gate because I immediately, again, want to highlight those divisions or things that may come up. If everyone is super duper apart, to Bernice's question, then now we got to have a different conversation of just maybe what's hanging us up is we got to talk about words. So maybe your idea of equity looks different than my idea of equity. Rather than talking about the world, let's put a pin in that. Let's just talk about what does equity look like? So what do you mean when you mean equity? So that may be something I have to do. But if everyone is, we're starting to see this world that's coming together, then the next thing I do is some type of exercise that talks about who they need to be. So who do you need to be as an organization to get to that world? If they haven't answered it already, what are the indicators that need to be done to get to that world? How does that relate to things that matter to you? How does that relate to things that you experienced in your childhood that you were like, never again? I want to make certain that no one else has to experience that. And then I move into the reverse engineering to your point. So, all right, let's find that North Star. I'm looking at what the world looks like. It looks like to me, going back to some of these, I know community was a big one. Building community, having space for community, connecting the community was something else that was really, really important that came up in some of the visions. I see connection several times. Strong communities was something that was important. We had some that were super explicit around, not having sustainable organizations, people not being exploited, strong social institutions. And so what I would do is I would really get clear on that language, like I did earlier with imagination and North Star. So what does strong social institutions look like? What does it look like to work backwards from that? What are some strategies that might lead to that? And so when I do the strategies, then I might have them start with strategies, and then I would do a lateral thinking to get them really excited about what strategies might be related. And so I would build it all into the same day, to your point. Now, if you have more time, the more time for imagination, the better, because again, when do we get to imagine? And even if it's little bits of imagination that you put into multiple sessions, I still would have dot connection that gets more and more specific as you go throughout the day. So starting really big, what's the vision? What does the world end up looking like? Who do we need to be to get to that vision? Maybe how, getting into values. What are the barriers currently in place to getting to that? Looking at foundational statements. Let's look at our mission statement. I can't tell you how many people, when we look at their mission statement, are totally opposite to the vision that they had for the world. And they're astounded, because the vision statement was something that they were really committed to. And it made sense when they developed it. But like I'm looking and I tell them, all right, we can keep the vision, your mission statement or your vision statement or your values, but I'm looking at what you told me the world looks like, and they don't connect. So what do we do here? It's a great way of addressing incongruence, by the way, if you see people who are acting differently than what they say they want to do. And then we move from foundational statements to what are some of the actions that we can start to take. And I do always try at least to finish up a session or a retreat with that, because I agree there's those who are going to be like, why did we do this? We just sat and talked about our dreams for 2 hours. And, we're not talking about what that relates back to in terms of the work that we're doing. So definitely make sure that you have some of the strategy in that. And then something in terms of wrapping that up that I've started doing that I love, and I've seen it have a really visceral response, or have had a really visceral response from clients. I write up that narrative. So I create a written narrative of the world and have it read as a story. It's 2060. This happens. This exists. This is in the world. EWB is doing this, this, and this. They're wrapping up because they just finished out this, this, and this. It's actually really powerful to read a narrative of how the world looks when you get to where you thought or think you want to go. So that is another thing that can be helpful in terms of setting the goals, because now you've got this narrative and it's like, all right, well, we said we're doing this, this, and this. What does it mean to reverse engineer that and work backwards to getting that? Hopefully that answers your question, Justin. If it didn't, let me know. But it was a great question, because you definitely need to have some type of action-oriented dot connection integrated in, or you're going to lose some of the folks that you're talking to. Oh, before I forget, and another exercise that can be helpful, I had it on the slides, but I didn't talk about it. 6 thinking hats is a way of having people follow a process. It's a way of keeping people in one direction. There's those instances where, okay, great, where we're visioning and we have that one, it's called a black hat. It's like, nope, we've done that before. Didn't work. And so what 6 thinking hats does is Edward de Bono came up with literally 6 different hats, different colors, and you follow the group through the hats. So you may start with red and say, what's one word that sums up how you feel about this? And then you may go to the blue hat and talk about something. And then the white hat, which I think is like resources, or what information do we need? All right, we're only on the white hat. We're talking about the white hat right now. All right, we're on the green hat. This is ideas. This is, new things. What does that end up looking like? But it's a great way of kind of getting people in the same direction, to your point, so that people can say, all right, we're done with the green hat, daydreaming, big ideas. How do we get to the blue hat? Like next steps. And what does that look like, so that everybody's going in the same direction? There's some problem with the language and framework of the 6 thinking hats. I do want to acknowledge that for those who are like, wait, black hat is negative. Does she see that? I do. But I have had the exercise be helpful. You can come up with whatever colors you want, frankly. But I found that that's another great way of kind of moving people along. But thank you, Justin. I guess we have like 5-6 minutes left, Bernice. Mm-hmm. Anyone else have any questions in terms of how to implement this, how to translate it for populations you're working in? I would definitely say, if you're translating, if you're doing tools with the community, have the community work with you to brainstorm on what those tools look like. That's another question I tend to get quite a bit. Don't just impose tools on them, because that's another great way of losing folks, particularly indigenous populations, native populations. And I use that word, broadly, indigenous to a place, to a land, to a country. I've gone into community, like the Fifth Ward community here, which is predominantly Black. And I ask, what do you do? What are your rituals? What are your ceremonies? What visions have y'all talked about? Like I try to integrate the treasures of what exists there into the work that I do, so that it's not just me imposing it on them, but it's rooted to their history and culture and time, geography and place and all those other different things. Because these populations are used to having people impose stuff on them, right? So it's great to work alongside them in developing some of these things. It turned out, for example, Fifth Ward has a rich history with food. So we've integrated food and eating in its different iterations as rituals and ceremonies in that community for works that I'm doing, because it's just it has such a rich history. And it bridges, back to the point, it bridges the divides. Anyone else have questions? Okay, Bernice, I'm okay with giving time back, but I leave it up to you all. Let me know.
I think if there's no more questions, we're free to end the session here. But thank you so much, Erin. Honestly, it's been really insightful to think about imagination and finding your North Star. And I really like that point about the vision not being static, because I feel like it's really easy to just hinge on something and not want to let it go. So I really appreciate that. And it's been a pleasure spending this time with you. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. And I'll hang around a few minutes too, in case anyone does have any questions. Oh, and be easy on yourself before I let you guys go, or you all, my guys. To your point, Bernice, we do that because that's what we're taught, right? We're taught you got to have the vision, put the vision out there. I mean, it's the startup and all this other kind of language. And so as you all are running into some resistance or like, man, why am I not getting it? Please be easy on yourselves, because capitalism and all the isms have us think differently. And so it's just it's just reminding ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for everybody who still is in the call, Erin will stick around so you can have a conversation with her. We do have a 30-minute break in our schedule right now, so this would be a great time to step away from your screen, stretch your legs, grab something to eat. If you still have energy, we do have the networking sessions still open. We also have the Canada-Africa Innovation booth open as well, so you could step into those spaces and have some more conversations. And I will see you all at the Global Vaccine Case Study Workshop at 4:15 p.m. EST. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your grace and your time. And I will hang back. I'll hang back a couple minutes. Sure. I'll put them. I'm not huge on the socials, but you're definitely welcome to follow. That's my Instagram, Clarity03. And then I think, thank you. I appreciate that. That's a beautiful name, by the way. Legal Eagle 2010 is my Twitter. And then, of course, you're welcome to find me on LinkedIn as well. But happy to continue having this conversation. And I do share practices and resources. I'm putting together a resource list on some of this stuff for some fellows that I'm working with here in Houston, some young adults now. And so can definitely circle back and try to get that out to you all if it would be of value. How do we make space with our community partners to have these brainstormings when they had? Yeah. An amazing question with like 45 seconds left. But so I get this. And so what I would end up doing is find ways to integrate this into conversations that are already being had. I've talked about it in a very, in its own space and time, because there's so little time that's dedicated to it that I like to do that. But you can absolutely sneak in a lateral thinking exercise here. You can sneak in a visioning exercise if you're talking about setting up for the strategic plan for the next 5 years. So there's ways of integrating this work into what you're doing already. And then some of it is also stretching those partners and getting them to see it a little bit differently. So I've had clients absolutely like that. And I think once I did the lateral thinking and a couple of exercises with them and they saw how excited people were and they saw the ideas were different, sometimes the proof is in the pudding. Oh, wait, was that a Cosby? Scratch that. But yes, sometimes you have to do the thing in order for it to resonate with folks. So maybe just kind of sneak in a 5-10 minute something where they can start to see the value because they'll see the work product. Because sometimes that's what people speak, right, is work product. And so if they see the work product, they're like, we're not still feeling it, but we like what came out of it. So we're going to go with it. And if I can help, please, again, shoot me a message because I do encounter that. And it is a process. Hopefully I answered your question. No problem. All righty. Well, I know we're at 1:31. I'll let you all get to break, but thank you again for your time. If you still kind of hung around, and feel free to shoot me something through LinkedIn or any of the other channels, and I'm happy to help. And thank you, Bernice and Geneva and the EWB team for having me.